Someone, Luke writes in his gospel in chapter 9, says to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." And because Luke, likely intentionally, does not give a name or context to this person, that it's just someone, universalizes it to encompass all disciples, past, present, and future. And indeed, as disciples of Jesus, we join this declaration of someone, Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." Which means we need to pay attention to Jesus' haunting response. Because it's not, "Oh, wonderful," or "Thank you," or some sort of Price is Right. "Oh, and because this decision you've just made, here's your prize." Jesus' response to that statement, with no sort of transition. Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Not exactly what someone was expecting to hear, but it's evidently what they needed to hear then and now. What was Jesus getting at? Will you stand with me this morning as we read Acts chapter 25, verses 13 to 21. Luke writes, "Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, 'There's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar.'" The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Much of sermons are looking at a particular text in a micro sort of way. And I want us to look in a macro way, zoomed out a bit from the specifics. And to do so, you have to get caught up with the different characters that bring Paul to this point in the narrative. You remember last week, Paul is giving his testimony to a mob who is attempting to beat him. And he's in the custody at that time of Claudius Lysias, who was a Roman tribune, so a decently high-ranking Roman official. Claudius can't figure out what the deal is. Why is this mob causing a riot in the city over Paul? So, like the despot he is, he orders Paul to be taken back to the barracks, and this is back in chapter 22, to be examined by flogging to get to the bottom of it. So he was going to have Paul tortured. And they get him, as it says in the text, they stretched him out for whips when Paul reminds them that he is a Roman citizen, a citizenship that he paid for fairly earlier in life. And this is a big deal because Roman tribunes could not arrest, much less torture, Roman citizens based on the accusations of a mob. And not just any mob, but from the perspective of Rome, their perspective would have been, hey, if there's a problem between some crowd of Jews and a Roman citizen, your job is to get the crowd of Jews under control. And yet here Claudius is with the Roman citizen stripped and stretched out, ready to be whipped. And if Claudius Lysias's superiors found out about this, it would be a different person, stripped and bound, getting ready to be examined by flogging. So Claudius, it says, was afraid, and I bet he was. And he unbinds Paul, brushes him off, asks him what his favorite food is so that he can go get takeout and bring it back. He gets him a night and a spa package at the Jerusalem Four Seasons. He commands the chief priests and Jerusalem council to appear before him. And I bet he did. Oh, who was instigating this, Mr. Very Reverend Sir Paul? Oh, that chief priest? Well, I am going to command him to appear before us at once. So Paul, once again, he tries to mend fences. They're not having it. So much so, a group of this former mob, they take an oath with one another not to eat or drink until they have done away with Paul. Word gets back to Paul of this plot. Word gets back to Lysias of this plot. And so he sends Paul out with a protective cohort of soldiers, sends him to Caesarea to appear before the governor of Felix. He don't want to fool with it anymore. Felix was the Roman governor of Judea at that time. And Lysias sends this letter with Paul to Felix, and it's pathetic. Of course, he paints himself as having rescued Paul from this dangerous Jewish mob and ensuring that he was cared for and protected, totally omitting that little bitty fact where he was going to torture him. Regardless, Felix holds Paul in the palace in Caesarea, and he awaits to hear from these same Jewish officials, high priest and others, what's the deal? Why is Paul here? Why am I having to deal with this? Etc. So those guys go down to Caesarea. At this point, we're in chapter 24. They give this sycophantic plea to Felix. Oh, most excellent Felix, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. That kind of nonsense. And Felix, of course, was a brutal governor. So this was all lies and theater. But they lie about Paul. They don't convince Felix. And so he orders Paul to just be held in custody, accompanied by a centurion. But he gives him pretty significant liberties. Felix knows it's all nonsense, but he has to do something. It's like a house arrest of sorts, though he's in Herod's palace there in Caesarea, so it's not a terrible house arrest. And he has a Roman sentry with him, but he can go see people. Folks can come see him. Now, here's a key verse. This is close to the end of chapter 24. It says, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Now again, prison is not exactly how we think of that. But regardless, Paul had to live in these circumstances for 2 years. And it's not done. Felix dies while Paul is still in custody. And Festus, Porcius Festus, takes over the Roman Judean governorship. Now, before assuming power in Caesarea, Festus makes a trip to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem leadership, they still haven't let it go about Paul. 2 years later, they're still not over it. So they plead with Festus, oh, please, bring Paul up here, because they're still planning to kill him if he does. Festus doesn't agree to that, but he brings some of them back down with him to Caesarea to make their case once again against him there. So they do. Everything is repeated, sycophantic flattering of Festus now, lies about Paul. Paul gives a calm defense, rinse, wash, repeat. And then Paul says, I tell you what, can I just make an appeal to Caesar? Now, as a Roman citizen, he can do that. And Festus agrees to that appeal. He goes, okay. And so at some point, he decides, I'm going to send Paul. He can go settle this with Caesar. I don't have to deal with it. In the meantime, King Herod Agrippa, sort of junior, son of King Herod who died earlier in Acts, he and his sister Bernice, and we'll just leave it at that, come through Caesarea, and Festus brings this all up to them. And that brings us to our text that we read, which is Festus's explanation to Agrippa of what's going on with Paul. Now, the story is not over for Paul, but we'll get to that in later weeks. The point in going through this is to see that here Paul is, an upstanding Roman citizen. He doesn't hate that. He's not embarrassed by it. He's not trying to be some rebel and overthrow Roman power or Roman institutions. He's an upstanding Roman citizen. He's a proud Jew. His calling and revelation of Jesus, even though it profoundly changed things for him, it did not simultaneously negate his love for his people and tradition and culture. So he's a good citizen. He's a good Jew. And yet there is this conflict, ranging anywhere from outright hate, we want to kill you, to a sort of dismissive indifference. Leave him in prison. And from all sorts of characters ranging everywhere on the religious political spectrum. There's a Jewish mob. You've got Claudius the Roman tribune. You've got the Jewish high priest. You've got Roman governor Felix. You've got the Jerusalem council. You've got King Agrippa. And why? Why is he at odds with such a wide variety of people? Because, verse 19, a certain Jesus, who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. David Garland, who was my dean in seminary, in his commentary on Luke, he notes that Jesus' statement there, it has a political edge to it. Jesus isn't telling someone that to follow him means a life of literal homelessness, but it does mean a sort of homelessness to the ways of the world, to the power structures of the world. Because by extension, to follow Jesus, to give your allegiance to him, to affirm with the testimony of your life that he is indeed the resurrected Lord, God incarnate, sovereign King of eternity. It is to say that he alone is and all else is not. But here's the rub. In this world, many other things yearn for that kind of devotion. They falsely set themselves up as entitled to it and are threatened and will react accordingly when they don't get it. Like a mob, like a tribune, like a high priest, like a council, like a governor, like a king. Garland quotes T.W. Manson in his book, The Sayings of Jesus, quote, "Everybody is at home in Israel's land except the true Israel. The birds of the air, the Roman overlords, the foxes, the Edomite interlopers, have made their position secure. The true Israel is disinherited by them. And," he's speaking from the perspective of Jesus, "if you cast your lot with me and mine, you join the ranks of the dispossessed. And you must be prepared to serve God under those conditions." Joel Green, in his gold standard commentary on Luke, he says more broadly, quote, "Those who would be Jesus' disciples then and now must reckon with how identifying with Jesus might place them outside the boundaries of what is acceptable to a world not oriented toward the aim of God. Follow me, Jesus is saying, and you won't feel at home with the ways of this world, nor will you be invited home. You will not be welcomed home by the ways of this world. You'll be outside in all senses of the word. You'll feel outside and you'll be treated as such. And that's precisely where Jesus found himself. Falsely accused by Jewish authorities and indifferently appeased by Roman authorities. It's precisely where Paul finds himself in our text. Falsely accused by Jewish authorities and indifferently appeased by Roman authorities. And of course, you can probably make the next move. You, me, us, all because of a certain Jesus. Luckily, this kind of opposition will not likely involve ancient Jewish or Roman authorities, nor result, hopefully, in being imprisoned or with plots to be killed, but the same dynamics exist. There are still entities and authorities and abstractions, issues and parties and viewpoints that demand our total allegiance. Our culture is infected in this myopic, binary way. Name the issue, doesn't matter what the issue is, and the only given options to it are this or that. Yes or no. Pro this or anti that. And the assessments of those binaries, they just sort of keep increasing in hyperbole. Oh, that's Democrat, or that's Republican. That's conservative, or that's liberal. That's traitorous, or that's nationalist. That's Marxist, or that's fascist. And it's no surprise that at least in Western life, as religious commitment to Christ and His church decreases, that these positions and parties and partisanship, they increase in taking on this strange religious significance proportionally. Our culture, especially our brilliant secularists, have always thought that if religious commitment to Christ and church would decrease, everything else would stay the same. Perhaps even improve. And don't we feel so improved these days for it? But what that sort of theorizing fails to appreciate, besides, of course, religious zeal and commitment for, all of recorded human history, it's almost like there's something there, and the nation states that have tried to eradicate it entirely, utopian paradises like North Korea and the Soviet Union, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Mao Zedong in China, weren't those a lot better? So besides that sort of theorizing, failing to explain the genocidal horror in the sorts of places that have seen that dream come true, the reality of unapologetic atheist nation states, guess all our theories have their weaknesses. It also fails to properly account for reality. And the reality of God is true whether you believe it or not. Believe what you want about gravity, but take a jump off of something and down you will go. So regardless of belief, intrinsic to our being, because of our Creator God, is a capacity for what we call religion, for transcendence, for the divine, to make up a word that I think works, ultimates, a combination of ultimate and importance. And if that capacity is not filled properly by Christ and His church, it will be filled wrongly. But there's no such thing as neutrality. No one worships nothing. And if the source is not Jesus, that religious capacity will find a source elsewhere. And to bring that into today, it is no surprise that our politics and institutions, and thus all of the issues that fall under them in public discourse, have become that substitute and taken on this weird religious ultimates. And because of that, the demands of allegiance placed on us, their religious subjects, are total and uncompromising. Leaders expect total allegiance and submission, even though they wouldn't say that. They speak not to inform or persuade, but as if we, their subjects, await their instruction, that we might obey. Critique is treated not as an opportunity for discussion and debate, but as blasphemy. Well, how dare you disagree? Fundraising and advertising, it's always apocalyptic. Or the world and democracy is always at stake. Groupthink, orthodoxy, is an enormously strong dynamic. We all know what you can, and more importantly, what you cannot say. Unless you whisper it, and only around certain companies. Certainly don't make it public. And because it's orthodoxy, it's set, and there's this faith to it. And any information to the contrary is not to be considered, but rejected, because it's threatening. And anyone who dares question the orthodoxy or its canon or its dear leader is excommunicated, ruined, kicked out of the group, whatever the group is. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum we're talking about. I defy you to tell me a paradigm that better explains the insanity of our world's behavior around so many things than a paradigm of religion. Politics is not new. But can you remember a time where politics disrupted families and friends like it has over the past few years? Where people cut others entirely out of their lives. And some are fine with it. They brag about it. Something else is at play. Someone else is at play. What we're seeing is religious behavior misapplied and truly blasphemously, erroneously assumed by entities and authorities. And into this secular religious domain enters you and me and us. And there is immense pressure to participate in it on the terms that are set by the players in it, the parties, the spokespeople, news organizations, the drivers of the narratives. We're to pick a side and ferociously defend it, attack those who disagree, give these entities and positions our fealty and devotion, be willing to cut out anyone and anything in life that thinks otherwise. And though that pressure is great, just turn your computer on. Our participation in it only affirms and implicitly supports the idolatry of it all. Refuse and stand firm. These entities and parties and partisan narratives and social media groupthink, they are not your home. They're not where you belong. Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If we are committed to follow that Son of Man with our lives, don't be surprised. And surely we have all experienced this to some degree. Don't be surprised when you see the discourse and you see the positions. You can only be A or you can be B. When you see the parties take their stance, when you even see churches and denominational entities get wrapped up in these parties and positions and narratives and stake their ground accordingly, don't be surprised when you see it and think to yourself, I don't know where I belong. I'll tell you where you belong. Not to a party, not to a position, not to a president, not to a policy, not to a politic, but to a person. A certain Jesus. And you just need to know, when that certain Jesus has your unqualified, total allegiance, and your life reflects that accordingly, and by extension, all the things clamoring for that same allegiance don't get it, and they don't get it how they define it. They don't get it on the terms that they want it. Just know they won't understand, and they won't get it. They won't agree. They'll say you're wrong, that you don't get it. It's how it was for Jesus himself. Hello, cross, crucified. It's how it is for Paul. Jewish authorities want him on their terms or dead. Roman authorities want him on their terms, but he doesn't belong to either one of them. Who he does belong to, look how dismissive they are in verse 19. Festus says, I don't know what they're arguing about. It's something religious, something in their own little piddly religion about a certain Jesus who was dead. Paul asserts to be alive. Who can confirm these things? They don't believe it. A certain Jesus. It's like saying, I don't know what their deal is. It has to do with some Jesus. They didn't get it then. They don't get it 2,000 years later, so be it. Your life is one sent with a certain Jesus. And unlike these parties and politicians and presidents and platforms, these issues and ideologues who are so terribly self-important, puffed up with a pride that's only exceeded by its ignorance to how small, infinitesimal in importance, impotent in comparison, utterly inconsequential to the ineffable, incarnate, eternal Word. And indeed, that certain Jesus who is so easily dismissed is the one at whom demons tremble, the one at whom storms cease, the one by whom disease is healed, the one by whom the dead is raised, the one by whom, through whom, and for whom all things were created, the one under whom sin and evil lie conquered, the one whose dominion stretches from eternity to eternity, the one, when it's all said and done, at whose name every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord, and you belong to him. To that certain Jesus. And worthy of reflection is, where do I need to live accordingly? Where am I participating in and perpetuating this idolatry and false binary and false ultimates of our wannabe religious secular entities? Am I living a life in fear of man, trying to fit in, instead of understanding that to follow Jesus is to fundamentally not fit in? And in what ways and unto whom can I be a winsome witness to the glorious and eternally unchanging truth that there is one Lord, and all of reality is defined on his terms? Let your life proclaim what we sang earlier. Crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon his throne. Hark how the heavenly anthem drowns all music but its own. Awake my soul and sing of him who died for thee, and hail him as thy matchless King through all eternity.